On May 15, 1944, a task group of the Atlantic Fleet heads out to sea with orders to operate against submarines to the west of the Cape Verde Islands. The group comprises the USS Guadalcanal and her 5 destroyer escorts, the Pillsbury, the Chatelaine, the Pope, the Flaherty, and the Jenks.
This is Plausibly Live, the official podcast of the Dave Bowman Show.
Welcome aboard. 'Tis I, Dave. Glad you're with us today, and I am pleased to have with me this afternoon the author of a new book called Codename Nemo. Charles Lachman is with us. He's actually a prolific author and involved with a lot of projects as well. Charles, can you kind of introduce yourself, tell people who you are and what you do?
Sure. First, thanks so much for inviting me on your show, Dave. Really appreciate it. I'm the executive producer, my full-time job, of Inside Edition, the syndicated TV news magazine that's produced by CBS here in New York. And I also write books, nonfiction narrative histories, and I've written 5 books. My latest is just out now, Codename Nemo, the hunt for a Nazi U-boat and the elusive Enigma machine. And it's a nonfiction World War II thriller that I think is action-packed and exciting, and that's what I'm here to talk about.
So let's start with a little bit of writing type stuff. You got a full-time job. How do you find time to write? And what is it that inspires you to write these nonfiction narratives like this? I mean, that's a lot of research, a lot of work, and you just roll out of bed in the morning and go, "Hey, I'm ready to write today."
Not exactly. First, I totally appreciate the question. It's a good question. I get that asked a lot, just from people who know what I do. And you're right. Being executive producer of a nationally syndicated TV show is challenging. It's a lot of hours. I really put in more than a time and a half on the job. But I love it, and it's exciting work. I like to compare it to a fighter jet pilot, with one exception: you can't get killed. But it's exciting to do. And then I find projects that I work on weekends, and book projects, and I got to get really worked up about a subject for it to interest me. And you find the hours. I like to joke that you have to have the devotion, the discipline to see the project through. It takes multiple years to research and write. And I'll also add that it helps to have no friends and absolutely zero social life.
I'm with you there. You said something interesting there. You got to have a passion for this story. Now, this story that you're telling in this book, Codename Nemo, this is a story that I'm surprisingly finding isn't as well known as I certainly thought it was or should be. It's a story that I've known basically my whole life. I read about this story 1976, I think, when I was in junior high school or high school just starting out. But I had a passion for the Navy, and I had a passion for submarines. And so it was one of those stories that caught in there. How did you come to this story? And what is it that attracts you to this?
Well, a full confession, I did not know about U-505. I am not bad at history. I've written history books. I'm not bad at World War II, but I had never heard the story of U-505, so there it is. What happened was my wife and I were visiting one of our daughters in Chicago a number of years ago, a few Thanksgivings ago, and her boyfriend at the time wanted to keep the parents entertained and created this whole itinerary. And top of the list was a visit to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. And the U-505 exhibit. So I walk in there, all very much worked up about seeing a real Nazi U-boat. We go down 5 levels to the sub basement, and you walk into this giant hall, and you see this extraordinary exhibit, and there is a Nazi U-boat. And my first reaction was, how is this even possible? How did they capture a Nazi U-boat in World War II on the high seas? And I turned to my wife and I said, this is a book. I happened to be looking for a new project at the time. This is a number of years ago. And then that's when I did a deep dive. And the further I researched it, the more obsessed I became with telling the story in a unique way. You're absolutely right. People who served in the U.S. Navy and in the submarine service, they may or may not know about U-505. I actually ran into a young man over the weekend, a great kid, just got accepted into the U.S. Naval Academy starting in a few weeks. He had no idea. He had never heard about U-505. I'm sure he will once he gets into the academy. But I just realized that, again, the further I researched it, the more I realized that the story had not been told in a way that using my writing skills and research skills could tell. I don't want to be boastful. I don't want to sound boastful. But I knew I had the capacity to tell a truly compelling story, a work of narrative nonfiction in a way that would revitalize interest in this extraordinary event.
I find that fascinating. Now, I'm disclosure here. I've read the book. Charles sent it to me, and I have notes, Charles. I don't know if you can see that or not, but I have notes.
I can.
And I have questions. But this book it's an interesting way to tell it. What I told my audience yesterday on WMMB was that it's written in that present tense narrative style. And I found that both very unusual. You don't read a lot of books like that, history books especially. But number two, it was very, it just draws you in, and you feel like you're actually getting to know these characters. So my first question is, most of these people are long gone. How did you get to know them so well?
Another good question. What happened, and you're right, I only realized later in the research process that I had the capacity, the information to write in the present tense, and I think that adds a lot of electricity and energy to the piece. And I went that way because I wanted the reader to experience this great adventure, this great moment in U.S. naval history, the way these volunteer sailors experienced it. That was the goal. And what happened was, and I didn't know whether I could deliver that, whether it would work or not, until I got access to the archives, primarily at the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. I communicated with them once I became interested in the subject. This is after my first visit to the museum, and I said, I want to write a book, and again did a deep dive into they were gracious enough to open the doors of their archives to me. And they came out with boxes and boxes. If you've ever been to a historical archive department, you know how musty and dusty it is, and you have to wear gloves, and they come out with boxes of material, dozens of them. And I took time off from work. This was my vacation, and open up box after box after box, and what I found was this treasure trove of material that had never been tapped before. They were primarily the interviews that these volunteer heroes, these sailors, conducted in 1999 and for the museum, for their archives, for history. And they were hours and hours long. They were detailed. And then, lo and behold, the Germans who were captured on U-505 also had their remembrances stored in the archives of the museum. So suddenly I realized I had the beginnings of a great cat and mouse story. I could tell the story from the German point of view and also primarily from the American point of view. So in other words, how the hunter, meaning U-505, became the hunted.
It's really well done, and I found myself really drawn into the characters that I had not known before. Of course, growing up the way I did, I knew who Captain Gallery was, I knew who the lieutenant was and stuff like that, but you really captured the U-boat characters as well, and I want to dive into this. I've got a lot of questions, as I said earlier, but let's start with kind of an elevator pitch of the book. What is the book really about?
Well, the book is about the saga of how Captain Dan Gallery, a brilliant, innovative, maverick Navy captain, came up with this crazy scheme. Even he called it a cockamamie plan. He was inspired by a brief conversation in the Officers Club at the naval base in Reykjavik, Iceland, in 1942. And they were chewing the fat, and some guy threw out, "Hey, what if we were to capture a Nazi U-boat?" And Captain, then he was a Commander Gallery, kind of, it stuck in his head. He left the bar, the Officers Club, and it just simmered in his mind. And over the years, he became filled with how to pull this off. So then he became the commanding officer of the captain of the USS Guadalcanal, a baby flat-top aircraft carrier in World War II. And that gave him the means to fulfill his dream, this ambition of becoming the first naval officer to capture an enemy U-boat in time of war since, get this, the War of 1812.
1815, as I recall.
It happened in 1815.
And you also tell the story of the U-505, which is the U-505 to me is a fascinating ship. She's not what I would call a lucky ship in the strictest of sense. She doesn't, miraculously escape from everything. It seems like every time she turns around, none of the advantages of the happy times or anything like that come her way. But she's a survivor up until we get to the climax of the story.
That's true. I would call it a hard luck ship. It had a respectable record during the war in the early days. I don't want to minimize what it did because it destroyed and killed a number of U.S. merchant ships, and a number of U.S. merchant sailors lost their lives due to U-505's attacks. But it was lucky for the Americans, it was also a dysfunctional ship. The key event in the life, if you will, of U-505 was the fact that its second captain, a German Nazi, I say Nazi because he was a member of the Nazi Party, named Peter Zesch, when he was named captain of the boat. And he was, at that point, the German Navy's youngest U-boat captain. And he had all the pedigree of what the Nazis were looking for in a U-boat commander. He was the son of a Navy doctor. He was a graduate of the German Naval Academy. And he looked the part. He looked like a member of the Aryan master race. But he really was never cut out to be a commander. He was a heavy drinker. He was arrogant, imperious, mean-spirited, and the crew detested him. And what happened was that he was engaged. He was commanding officer of U-505 when some British destroyers started pounding it with depth charges as it was leaving its French port. and he panicked in the face of enemy fire, and he ended up blowing his brains out during the height of the battle, and he became the first German naval officer, so far as I could tell in my research, to kill himself in the face of battle. So it was a tremendous embarrassment to the German high command, and it led to further chaos and dysfunction that ultimately led to the capture of the U-boat by the Americans.
One of the things that the captain did that I really connected with, in fact, it's one of the things I noted and underlined. He threw out their traditions. When they went to sea, they would throw the flowers overboard, and he put a stop to that. And I want to make sure people understand how much to a crew that just turns them against captains quickly as you can get. And I'm glad that you captured that, because that's, to me, that was one of the telling points of him, was he was willing to sacrifice his crew's traditions for his own whatever. And I'm not even sure what he was trying to prove, but there you go. So the ship goes to sea, the U-505 goes to sea. Gallery has this plan to capture a U-boat. It's a crazy plan, and it's a plan that isn't necessarily universally engaged, but he's going to try it anyway. He teaches his pilots to fly at night. And again, I don't think people understand how important that is off a jeep carrier, a escort carrier. He teaches these guys to fly at night. But it's not, the hunt isn't easy, is it?
No, it's not. You're right about his ambition of sending out his planes during night, because that was the critical time to hunt and kill Nazi U-boats. During the war, they would emerge usually at night because they were less vulnerable to enemy search and destroy missions. And to Gallery, that was the opportunity that he sought to break the back of the U-boat menace by making his planes off the Guadalcanal operating 24/7 during his task forces. So yeah, that was a critical part of the of his effort to smoke out a Nazi U-boat. But of course, the goal there was to blow them up, to blow them to kingdom come, to send them to the bottom of the sea. It was only when he thought through his plan of action did he come up with this idea of not pulverizing it out of existence, but damaging it enough. We can get into this enough so that it forced the U-boat captain to surface and abandon ship, and forced the German sailors to bail out. And that led to the empty shell of the U-boat and enabled Captain Gallery to send a raiding party over to capture it.
It's an intense hunt, folks, and we don't have all day to go through the entirety of it, but they finally find the U-boat. They don't really know which one it is yet, but they find her. As Charles has said, they get it to come to the surface by not pulverizing it yet. And then an order that is given, which hasn't been given in the United States Navy since 1815, away borders, and off go 9 men. And these 9 guys are, I have multiple notes on them. They are everything that represents America. In fact, you say that at one point. 6 of the 9 are children of immigrants, but they are Americans to the core. Tell me about some of these guys.
It was one of the delights in researching the book was to get to know these great men, and they were kids. They all volunteered for this mission. To be perfectly honest, they felt it would never happen. They put their names down when one of the Navy lieutenants went around the ship, in this case the USS Pillsbury, looking for volunteers for this super secret mission. Sure, the way kids are. Yeah, sure, I'll give it it a whirl, but they never really expected it to happen. They thought it was just ludicrous, the whole idea of capturing a Nazi U-boat on the high seas. But they were, one guy, Wayne Pickles, was the high school quarterback hero. He grew up in the Alamo, of all places, in Texas, and his father was a army officer, but he rebelled and joined the Navy. And he kept a diary of his life in the Navy on the USS Pillsbury. Another volunteer was a roofer from Chicago, whose mother was a Lithuanian immigrant. Another one was a kid from the Boston area whose parents were born in Germany. They came here as immigrants. His mother did not want him to join the Navy. She felt that it would be he would be fighting the motherland or the fatherland. And but he was American to the core, as you say, and he signed up anyway in despite his mother's reluctance. So these were men who were willing to risk it all to carry out the mission. And I was just so impressed, not just with what they did during, but also what they did after.
Did you get to meet any of them personally?
No, they're all gone. What I did was reach out to their family members, and they were wonderful to deal with. They totally cooperated with the research of the book. They saw it as an opportunity to praise their father, who they've been gone for quite a number of years now. And as I say, in Wayne Pickles' case, the family gave me his private war diary that he kept during the years he served in the Navy. They all were anxious to help out. They gave me letters, remembrances of what their dads talked about. Very interesting is that they're very humble men. After the war, all they wanted to do was resume their civilian lives. They wanted to get married. They wanted to raise families. They wanted a good job. And that's what happened to them. And they really didn't want to talk about their experiences. Like a lot of veterans to this day, they don't want to talk about it. There's this one story that I found to be so moving. The guy from the Boston area, his nickname in the Navy was Flags because he was a signalman, and he raised 3 kids, good kids. And one day his son came home from college, and for whatever reason, Flag's wife went into the bedroom and opened up the nightstand and came out, and she showed her son, who's just in from college, a box, and she opened the box, and inside was a silver star, and she said, "Your dad was a war hero." And it was only then, for the first time in this college kid's life, that he knew that his father, that he heard about U-505, and that he knew that his father was a war hero. I thought that was remarkable, how humble and how they were just great guys. And I wish I had gotten to know them before they passed away, but such is the passage of time.
So many of these stories, and you have to wonder how many stories like that are still out there that we don't know about. It's remarkable to me in dealing with veterans every day. So let's kind of jump ahead a little bit in the story. They've managed to get the U-505 to the surface. These 9 men in a whaleboat go over there. I've been in a whaleboat myself. Can't tell you that I'd be willing to jump out of one onto a sinking submarine. And I love submarines. I've been on one. I love them. I'm not sure I'd jump out of a whaleboat onto one. It's not as easy as it sounds. And especially if you're dragging chains and machine guns. And tell me about it.
Well, it's amazing, really. As you pointed out, the ancient call came out, away borders, and that over the loudspeaker of the USS Pillsbury, which was destroyer escort that was in Captain Gallery's task force. So these 9 volunteers, led by a Lieutenant J.G. Albert David, had been in training for a number of weeks, preparing for this mission. Again, they didn't really expect it to actually happen, but they heard the call in the midst of this battle that forced the U-505 to surface, and they climbed into the whaleboat. They zipped across the ocean, along the way passing a whole bunch of German sailors who had abandoned ship. And the Germans called out in English, "Comrade, comrade, save us, save us." But they had a mission and they knew that they were going to be rescued by other Americans during the course of this action. So they zip across the ocean about 3,000 yards to U-505, which is spinning like a crazy top because its rudder had been jammed. And then one of the crewmen on the whaleboat grabs a bow hook and snatches U-505. The whaleboat is now snug next to U-505 by some miracle. And then the volunteers, proceed to climb on board. But can you imagine how dangerous it is? I mean, it's slippery from the ocean waves are crashing, so there's that. There's blood all over the top deck of the U-boat because a bunch of the Germans had been shot by the U.S. firepower. In fact, during the climb, the very first sailor to try to make it to the top of U-505 to top deck slipped and fell and was crushed between the whaleboat and the U-boat. And he really, really seriously injured his back, but they rescued him fortunately. But in that process, he dropped his chain and his toolbox. So right away, the mission was in jeopardy. But they finally all 9 of them get on board U-505. And meanwhile, Captain Gallery on the USS Guadalcanal is looking at them through his binoculars, and he can't believe this is happening. He calls out, "Hi-yo, Silver!" Like in the long range. He can't believe that these bucking Broncos, his men, that it was actually working. So they climb to the conning tower, and they see an open hatch, and the plan of action was to have one of the gunner's mate, who was armed with a Tommy gun, to go down first. But Lieutenant David, very heroically, pulled them back and said, "No, let me go." They fully expected to be shot down. So Lieutenant David, what leadership? He's willing to take the first bullets and accept the fact that he's going to die. And he's going to go first instead of the designated gunner's mate. And they, again, fully expected the U-boat to be filled with German sailors who were going to fight it out. And not only that, they expected it to blow up at any time because naval intelligence had alerted them that there were 14 detonators on board scattered around the U-boat. So he climbs down the ladder, and Lieutenant David, and he's facing this bewildering display of engines and dials and the smell, and there's a hole in the hole in the hull, and then his fellow sailors start climbing down to join him, and the first order of business was to plug up that hole, which they managed to do. It's kind of like a sea strainer, and they found the lid, and they clamped it down. And then the next order of business was to retrieve those the Enigma machine and the secret Nazi code books before the boat sank, because they fully expected it to go down. And they managed to create a human chain. They found 2 Enigma machines. They passed it one to another, and until they were top deck, and then they were thrown into the whaleboat, which is still alongside U-505. And it was a treasure trove of Nazi secrets, particularly the secret codes. They couldn't believe that the codes were still there, because all the Germans had to do was to dump a pail of water, and the secret codes would dissolve. They were made of a special paper and an ink that would instantly dissolve them. So again, it went to the dysfunction of the crew of U-505 that they left in such a panic that they left behind the most precious cargo that they had, which was the secret Nazi codes.
It's an amazing story. I mean, you go down that hatch. When you go down that hatch, normally it's impressive. But when you go down that hatch in that situation, onto a boat that's not an American boat, so nothing's in English, they had to have no real concept. I mean, you have some general ideas, but what does this valve do? What does that valve do? And the story of how they managed to stop the leak, get the Enigma machines and the codes, and keep that boat from sinking is going to keep you on the edge of your seat as you read through these pages. It is going to electrify you, as Charles said earlier. The boat is saved. Now it's a top secret dilemma. What do you do with it? You can't let the Germans know you've got it. What do you do?
The most important part of the mission was now at hand, other than capturing the U-boat, and that was how to maintain the secrecy. Because above all else, if the Germans had discovered that the U-505 had been captured intact and that its German naval codes had been compromised, well, that's the end of that value. As a matter of value of intelligence, it would have been thrown out the window. So they had to keep the operation top secret. And they did that a couple ways. One is they had to rely on the integrity of these 3,000 sailors, American sailors, who were witnessing this great event unfold. And Captain Gallery, under pressure from the Pentagon and his superiors at the Navy Department, had every man sign an oath, a secrecy oath, that if they spoke a word about the capture of U-505 to anyone, their sweethearts, their wives, their family members, their buddies at home. Bear in mind, this was the greatest war story imaginable. To keep that to say mum about it was, and for these young guys who just, love talking about the wartime, it was a challenge. But to the credit of all those sailors involved in the engagement, not one leaked it. Not one spoke about it until after the war was over and the Navy formally announced that a Nazi U-boat had been captured in 1944.
Not just in 1944. I think it's important to understand that this was June 4th, 1944. And had it gotten out that they captured this U-boat, June 6th was just 2 days away. And if the Germans start changing codes and all that right before D-Day, that could have cost thousands of lives. That's one of the reasons.
It could have. Right. It was one of the things about how valuable this material was is that the Allies, as you know, had access to earlier versions of the Enigma machine. This version was the latest, so that helped in terms of figuring out whether the Germans had improved the technology. But more important than that was the codes. Now, as you probably know, the codes change every other week in the German Navy. They always felt it was that you couldn't decode. They were so arrogant about their abilities to keep secrets that the Germans felt that their secret communications could never be deciphered. But the U.S. and the Brits, through the work of the brilliant mathematics professor Alan Turing, had figured out a way of deciphering the German codes. It's famously depicted in the movie The Imitation Game, if you've seen that. But what happens there is that it still takes thousands and thousands of computer time to decipher a single message. What this achievement was that the Nazi codes could be read in real time. So as soon as the communication went out from Berlin to the U-boat fleet, the Americans could read what they were saying. No computer time necessary. Real time, it was all in real time. And what a tremendous intelligence asset that was for the days immediately following D-Day.
It certainly changed the war in so many ways. There's a lot in this book that I want you to read, and I think you will be fascinated by this book because, again, it's written in that present tense, almost like you're reading a movie. It really is that intense. When we talked about this yesterday on the Bill Mix show down on WMMB, we had a question from a listener that I didn't have an answer to right there, and I'm going to throw the question at you. And the question is, what happened to the German crew? Now, I know what happened to them in general, but how did that make them feel? Why did we do it that way?
Well, I think this is one of the most fascinating parts of the U-505 story and Codename Nemo. And I should say that the reason why it's called Codename Nemo is that to secure the secrecy of the capture of U-505, Admiral King, who was fleet admiral of the U.S. Navy during the war, ordered that the name U-505 never be uttered again. That's why they actually made U-505 a submarine in the service of the U.S. Navy, and they called it the USS Nemo. And it's interesting that in Latin, Nemo means nobody. They had to convince the Germans that all the men of U-505 had been lost at sea, and presumably through either technical malfunction or in battle. And to do that, to preserve the integrity of this great achievement, they could not let the German POWs communicate with their loved ones back home in Germany. So you had 59 German POWs, some of whom were injured in the battle, including the captain, Lange, who had his leg amputated. And they were sent to a POW camp in Louisiana, where they spent the duration of the war. Now, this was technically in violation of the Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention, as we know, calls for the parties to let nations know who's a prisoner. But look, in my opinion, they did the absolute right thing. Thank goodness we had naval commanders who were able to make these hard decisions, and there was not really, frankly, a lot of discussion. I mean, they knew what they had to do. They had to keep this secret. So the German family members back in Germany assumed that they were all dead, and it was only in May, June 1945, after the war was over and the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, did they realize that their sailors were alive in a POW camp in Louisiana.
What a joy to discover that, I would imagine. They were...
yeah.
It would make me happy to find that out. In the end of all this, the U-505 is picked apart by the Navy. I mean, we learned everything there was to learn. We had their codes. The war ends. What happens with the U-505 after the war ends?
After the announcement by the Navy that they had captured a war, Captain Gallery was allowed to write an article about it. It was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Great article, actually. The U-505, now USS Nemo, was sent on a war bonds mission up the East Coast. So it would stop at various ports, Norfolk, New York, etc. And civilians were allowed for a fee to climb aboard the famous Nazi U-boat. And it was all designed to raise money for the war effort. Bear in mind that victory in Japan had still not been declared. There was a tremendous war going on in the Pacific. The war in the Atlantic and in Europe was over. And then eventually U-505 was sent to the U.S. Navy port in Maine. And there it sat for 10 years. There was one plan to blow it up for target practice, but when Captain Gallery heard about that, he just blew a gasket and said, "There's not a chance that you're going to let this historic relic of the war be blown up for target practice." So he used his influence in the Pentagon to make sure that didn't happen. But it took 10 years for them to figure out what to do with U-505, and that was mainly the work of Captain Gallery and his brother, who was very powerful in the city of Chicago. And they arranged for a fundraising drive and an act of Congress that transferred ownership of U-505 to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. The money that was raised was used to make it seaworthy, and it sailed 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. It ended up on the shores of Lake Michigan in 1954, and then was lifted across Lakeshore Drive one night and deposited in the backyard, literally the backyard of the museum. And over the years, it became a very popular exhibit. It's now, as I pointed out very early on, it's in sub-level 4 of the museum, away from the harsh Chicago elements, where it's preserved, hopefully forever, as a symbol of American heroism and bravery in the face of enemy fire.
One of the interesting things to me about it is that the Navy, of course, had picked off all the parts, just basically picked clean. But the German manufacturers take a lot of pride in that boat, don't they?
They do. There was a great effort to reconstruct U-505 to its original design. So the museum did a great job in determining the original paint color. And in 1954, when the boat was still in Maine, I mean, it was just in decrepit shape. You couldn't even safely walk on the top deck. There were holes everywhere, and it was deemed to be unseaworthy. But a lot of money and a great deal of hard work was made to reconstruct, if you will, U-505 and to its current condition, which is a work of historical importance that people can now see in Chicago.
I want to contrast that for just a moment with the fact that the U-505 still exists, but none of those 5 destroyer escorts or the Guadalcanal exist today. And that just hurts me. As a Navy guy, that hurts. It really does. It seems like we should have saved at least one of them.
Yeah, I agree. They were all mothballed and eventually sold for scrap or destroyed in target practice.
Sad. It would be remiss of us to get out of here. Once again, the name of the book is Codename Nemo. The author is Charles Lachman. The book is electric, folks. I'm telling you, you're going to enjoy it. It's going to read to you like you're watching a movie. I mean, that's the way it feels as you read it. It's written in that present tense that's just really intense. But I want to make sure that we acknowledge the fact that, okay, the boat is still there. The ships that caught her aren't. The men who did this are no longer with us. But those men, their stories have got to be told, and they are told here in this book. And just a reminder, some of these men, how did they go forward from this event? Because this is one of those things where you're 19, 20 years old. You do this. What is life after that war?
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons why they became such wonderful people to write about, because they're very humble about their experience. All they wanted to do after the war was raise families and get a great job. So they were, blue-collar guys. One became a roofer outside Chicago. Another, Wayne Pickles, became a Westinghouse refrigerator repairman. Another one, the guy in Boston, who they called Flags, built cables for Otis Elevator Company, and another guy in Queens, New York, had a milk run delivering milk from Queens to Manhattan, Two of them became firefighters, which is kind of interesting. So, but above all else, they wanted normal lives. They didn't really want to talk about their experience. It was a tug of war to try to get them to really talk. It was only in later years that they really opened up about their experiences. And I think part of the reason for that is that in the early days after the war in the 1950s, etc., they wanted to forget. They wanted to move on. But then as the years and decades went on and they knew that the time on Earth was coming to an end, really they started opening up. So if their grandkid said, "Hey, Pop, come over and give a talk to my school," okay. And they didn't have any fancy PowerPoint. All they did was take a chair, sit down in front of the class, maybe show them medal, and tell their story. That's all they needed. They were great, humble but brave Americans, and it was really an honor to get to know them and to write about them.
One of the reasons you should read books, folks, is you're not going to get any of those stories on Wikipedia or, on those kind of things. These are the kind of books you need to be reading, and you want to know about 9 great Americans, one of whom was a Medal of Honor recipient for this, the only Navy Medal of Honor in the Atlantic Theater, and awards given for this accomplishment. And these men went on because they were just Americans to the core, as Charles writes earlier. Charles, if you had to sum it all up about the experience of writing this book, the reception of the book, how's this book worked for you?
I'm proud of the book. I think it tells a captivating story. I try to bring whatever skill and talent I have as a writer to do the best job I could to tell the story in a way that people will read. I didn't want to write a dry history or a tech book or a book for U-boat nerds, if you will. As you know, they do exist. I wanted to tell a story that people could pick up and maybe this is the wrong word, but enjoy it. I wanted them to experience it the way these guys in the Navy experienced it. The thrill and excitement of going on a great adventure, the thrill and excitement of knowing about a great achievement that you couldn't say a word about. I think that's really an interesting part of the story.
Charles Lachman. The name of the book is Codename Nemo. You can get it on Amazon. You can probably get it at your local bookstore, I would hope. I'm always hesitant to say that because my local bookstore is kind of, but you can definitely get it on Amazon.
Yes, Amazon, any Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold online. It's sold at independent stores and Barnes & Noble bookstores. I know they're gradually kind of dissipating from our culture, but you still can buy books online wherever, on Amazon, etc.
Absolutely. Get the book, Codename Nemo, Charles Lachman. Charles, thank you for your time this evening.
Dave, thank you so much for your gracious invitation. I really enjoyed talking to you.